NOS4A22, Book 2, Trust No One, Chapter 22, Tag. Cammy stood there holding her jaw. Stewart watched as she put her hands on either side to pull her jaw back. It looked excruciating. She pulled her jaw back into place from dislocation. It was severely damaged as far as the nerves back up into her ears, but the bones weren't shattered. She had a small but strong jawline. Stewart was impressed with her willpower and her incredible enduring strength. The woman was the most amazing person he had ever even imagined existing. Stewart asked for a match or a lighter after the entire Barron family broke their frozen stance as they watched the goats run into the darkness of the forest. They stood there for about 20 minutes in silence before they could break free from the sadness and disbelief. The goats were their livestock and their meat all gone. It was 8 o'clock at night now. The hours of the evening had passed quickly after all the drama had passed the time. Stewart was handed a matchbook with 2 matches left in it. He folded the book over the burning ends and lit them to get the best possible outcome for a surefire contact to the pine needles he was holding. He had pulled out of a large pile next to a large old shedding tree. Stewart looked at Cammy and gave a nod of confirmation. He gave himself to the fire. The handful of quickly dissolving pine needles that burned quickly in his hand was let go and dropped into the pile where he had grabbed them from. He fell face first on purpose into the burning pile. This was to close up his wound where his nose was. He then had an idea once his face began to burn. He grabbed his cut-off nose that Cammy had spit out and stabbed it with a stick as the flesh on his face was soft and freshly melted. Stewart roasted his nose in the fire to give himself a natural patchwork of melted flesh that melded naturally over his nose hole. His face was charred, but the carved modifications were now gone. This strange sadistic act was redeeming for him in his own mind. It wasn't sadistic to him at all. In fact, he felt that it freed him of the curse he had carved into his own face that was now burned and gone. He felt that he would die in a state of purification, and Cammy felt it within his soul that was intimately shared with her in the most personal way. The noise of the goats' hooves faded away, and it had grown silent within the dark atmosphere of the village. The old conjoined homes were spectacular craftwork, composed of old mud clay that was mixed with an ancient gypsy-infused indigenous-style concrete, that in which the recipe was lost to the outside civilization. The outer walls were painted white with a mixture of bird dung and ground lemon flower. The roofs were mixed with the mud clay concrete and fashioned together with a base of stripped bark that had been dampened, then petrified. This was a very strong combination that proved to last for centuries, as Papa Barron had told them the village was much older than the United States itself. The design was like nothing to be compared to, as the doors, windows, and dimensions were in such odd angles, yet perfectly symmetrical for the most part, other than the obtuse tops compared to bottoms of smaller sections that seemed like balcony rooms coming outward from the second-story levels. All in all, this looked like an absolutely extravagant old village that had been well maintained. What was happening in the deep forest where the goats ran astray was truly terrifying. All of the young children had snuck away as soon as everyone resumed work. Everyone noticed they were gone a few minutes too late, once they had already wandered deep. They quickly realized that Critter was gone as well. He had actually tempted the children to follow after him, and little did they know it was his idea first to go after the goats to retrieve them. The children's curiosity had gotten the best of them. When they got to the point of where the goats were, they never could have imagined the horror that was waiting for them. as what they saw would forever scar their innocent minds if they could make it out alive. The sight of this possessed satanic ritual was burned in their subconscious just as Lamb had planned. Critter was in the middle of the crowd of goats, and they all had their faces pointed to the middle of the show before them. There were two inhumanoid beasts that were performing a satanic rape ritual on Matthew. Critter was entranced as he was stripped naked. He was in the middle of these two giant beasts that had bodies which resembled a man and a woman, yet the one on the bottom was a goat-headed being. The one behind him was the bull-headed being Cammy and Stu were warned of by Lamb, that haunted their dream in the wagon which woke them once they had arrived at the edge of the barren village. The goat had to be Baphomet itself, the goat of Azazel. It was not only a woman, but had an enormous cock above its vagina that was filled with Critter's genitals. Even his balls were consumed inside this giant vagina of the gigantic beast. Matthew was kissing this beastly thing as if he were on drugs, as he indeed was possessed. The tip of the gigantic penis of this inhuman black goat entity creeped up to find its way in between their sloppily smooching mouths. Critter panted along with the bleeding panting of the demon as his ass was harshly fucked from behind by this bull-headed demon. The steam could be seen entering the ears of Matthew from the heavily breathing out of the nostrils of this most evil bull-horned beast. As he was under possession along with the audience of goats, Matthew, who was known as Critter, committed the most vile and bestial ritual act. He impregnated Baphomet in the blackest of masses on Cammy and Steward's final day. All of the demonic evil spirits and entities were gathered there in one spot to witness and rejoice as the half-human, half-demon was conceived under possession. Once Matthew came, the demons exited his body, and the circled crowd of possessed goats all turned their heads at once in unison as they fixed their blackened eyes on the children. The children gave themselves away with their little lanterns their mothers had given to them, for meeting them at night when they needed their mothers while they worked in the fields. How sinister a thing to be caught by the very thing their mothers had made for them. They never would have gone after Matthew if they had not been given these old oil lanterns that shone so bright and consistently well throughout the night. It was tragic that what would have scarred the children forever in life would only stay with them in spirit. The children's nightlights were the end of them, and when the fathers caught up to them, their bodies were shredded down to strewn pieces of ripped and mangled meat all across the clearing between the dense trees. Their guts were still freshly extracted and eviscerated from their unrecognizable bodies, as they now were only remains. The goats acted as packs of rabid wolves and shredded them to pieces. As anyone knows, goats can eat anything. Matthew was thrown to the goats soon after he screamed when he was released from the possession after he had climaxed with Baphomet, goat of Azazel. One goat that was directly under Critter as he fell from the giant fallen tree hit him under his chin with a horn. The horn was long enough that it went through exactly the depth it needed to puncture his spinal cord as it penetrated the back of his throat, and he was thankful after realizing what he had done and all that had taken place. He witnessed the goats devouring the children as they began to tear them to pieces. This is what Matthew had to see before he died. Lamb ordained this so that he could capture their wandering souls to haunt Cammy and Stu as they died during that fateful night. Two unrecognizable children caked with blood and innards were running towards the posse of fathers in the search hunt. Little did the fathers know that these two children left alive were now possessed. They came running to them as if they needed help and ran in their arms, and the warm embrace of the welcoming two who had dropped down to their knees to let the boys run in for the hug. Immediately the boys began chomping down on the exposed neck flesh that was so close to their mouths to bite in the hugs. The demons within the boys then knew they would be attacked, so one of the possessed boys lowered his neck in ready fashion, and the other stopped biting the father as well, to move from one neck to the other as he sank his teeth into the little boy's ready neck. As the search party of gathered fathers couldn't do anything but watch in disbelief, all the search party of gathered fathers couldn't do anything but watch in disbelief. They then saw all the bloody mess that was scattered around the giant fallen tree, in which they knew quite well. This tree was a marker of their deep wilderness territory, as it signified as a landmark where the water was. Now their water was filled with the blood of their children, and it flowed down to the point where they would draw the water. The men became as babes crying in the wilderness, wailing loudly and without shame for their children, as their entire bloodline was now wiped out, other than this single, unidentifiable, possessed boy. A goat came running to the remaining boy and gave a strong headbutt, sending him into the air. The demonic spirit that was inside the boy left his body mid-flight, and the boy screamed as his body came crashing down to the ground for all the other goats to come and rip him to slop. The goats then stopped devouring rather quickly, as there was nothing left to fight over other than shitty pieces of guts, which two possessed goats had a tug-of-war with, because one had intestine tangled in and around its horns. The possessed goats then gave a look all at once to the fathers and stood still for a very long time. The stare lasted for what felt like forever, but in reality was about a full minute. A minute seems to last forever when you want to leave someplace. The men wanted to run, but were too scared to move, until they were forced to turn around quickly as the goats began to charge towards them in wrath and fury. Those fathers did not see the two giant beasts, because they had transformed back to spirit form within the spiritual dark realm. The Baphomet goat of Azazel and the bull-horned devil beast were traversing between the layers of extra-dimensional existence. Lamb had granted this special manipulation of reality as their shadows were cast into doors which acted as doorways which opened beyond time, as the keeper of time slipped through to hold the doors open. The gatekeeper was seen below and reminded them that the time was drawing near, as Cammy and Stu had less than 4 hours before midnight, when the chemical poison would run its course and chemical death would be achieved. Nothing made sense. With all that's been seen, all that's been heard, and all that's been done, this was madness taken to the extreme. These men were reduced to gibbering fools that had been charged by goats. The fathers in the failed search party stopped, as they no longer heard the stampeding behind them for a good few minutes, and they didn't care to turn back to give a look while they were running. So the men turned around once they all had stopped running in the now silence within the darkness of the woods. This deep wilderness was frightful, as it was without the dread of demonic spirits and evil entities possessing every living thing in sight. With the present danger that inhabited the darkness of this deep wilderness, these men were trembling and stuttering abominations that had been forsaken by their God. The fathers made their way out of the woods, back to the old village, and they were dumbfounded as to what they saw once they made the clearing out of the pines. The older boys were tending to the goats. This bothered them so badly, they all began to shake violently and uncontrollably in fear that made their loins give way. The goats were already back in the barn, and the failed search party could not understand how. They must have teleported or snuck in such a way they just couldn't comprehend. Impossible, they thought. This was demonic to the highest degree. What these men as fathers had seen rivals the most terrible things ever seen by anyone in recorded history. The horror they endured is worthy of the worst punishment within the deepness at the bottom of the lake of fire, where Lamb wished to send Cammy and Stu as the wish of Satan commanded. The gatekeeper was seen with the keeper of time, and they were revealed in glimpses in between the extra-dimensional layers outside three-dimensional reality. Haunting glimpses were shown to the remaining fathers and sons of their wandering spirit brothers and sons. They were seen slipping in and out of the splitting rifts beyond time and just outside their realm of the flesh. Father Time was seen. The gatekeeper was seen. Never before had these cosmic entities let themselves be known in such stunning clarity. Not to men that weren't called to die and immediately taken to the pit of Abaddon. This was surreal, and the remaining men were falling to the ground on their hands and knees in hysterics from the outrageous, overwhelming fear that overflowed through their nerves and out their senses that their bodies could not contain. The women saw what was happening and began screaming at the men, asking what was wrong, what's the matter. Once they saw for themselves, they had a terrible reaction and completely lost their composure. The mothers, wives, and sisters looked to the sky and put their hands out extended to God and screamed at the night sky. There was an unusual amount of light that was not only from their lamps and lanterns, but they noticed an infernal fire that was seen through the open rift. A large head was seen popping out, but it went back quick as lightning through a storm cloud. The goats had this look of bewilderment that went beyond confusion on their blank faces that had become their shared expression, while they were looking at the remaining older boys as they tended to the now calm beasts with blood of their brothers all over their furry mouths. The young men stroked and petted the goats with a zombified demeanor as if they were sleepwalking. The fathers and the women knew what was taking place. The goats were free from the evil spirits now, but the remaining barren sons were now overtaken by these same evil spirits that had left the goats and now entered them to inhabit, manipulate, and control them, to do the bidding of their evil commander, which was Lamb, the architect of chaos. The women began to scream all the more, and the young women and daughters held their mothers tight around their waists from sheer terror and uncontainable fear that destroyed all sanity within the village, which was the overall vibe of the place from that moment on. Then, just as they had seen the wandering spirits, they were gone as the rift closed. Cammy and Stu knew what that meant. Those wandering spirits were in the place they did not want to go, where they knew their parents also were dwelling beyond the gates. The gatekeeper closed the rift as the keeper of time went back inside. He had a presence about him that stunned everyone and would not turn his face toward all who looked at him. His back had a cloak draped over it that shimmered this color that could not be described because it was translucent and glowed with a type of energy that was celestially radiant, not different from an assumed angelic light. The game of tag had ended. The evil spirits had done what they came to do. It was now 10 o'clock, and the souls of the young children had been taken into the wandering spirit realm of darkness. There was great suffering there, and it was the birthplace of poltergeists. It was there children of lost souls went because their parents were damned. This was the curse of the Barron family, and none could ever escape it every 7th generation. This was their time, and this was their calling. Doom had come for the old gypsy village to reminisce yet again after 504 years.